What's one moment in your life that changed everything in your family?
Are you ready for a shocking truth? The house everyone in my family thought was guaranteed for my sister, the same house my mother laughed about and said should obviously go to her because she has kids, was mine all along. And I let them live in their little fantasy until I finally decided I was done being quiet. I can still hear the clink of my fork hitting the plate because I set it down slowly and deliberately, and the silence that followed carried more weight than anything else said that afternoon. My mom thought she was being funny, a light-hearted jab, but my sister smiled like she had just been crowned queen of the family estate, and in that moment, something in me clicked. I looked around the table, everyone waiting for me to either argue or laugh it off, and instead I said, very calmly, "That's cute, since I bought this house years ago." You could have heard a pin drop, and for the first time in my life, they all stared at me like I was someone they had never met. The thing is, I had been sitting on this truth for years, carrying the paperwork, the receipts, the signatures, and the reality of what really happened when the house almost slipped away. They didn't know, or maybe they didn't want to know, because it was easier to keep playing the same old script where my sister, Megan, was the chosen one, the golden child who deserved everything because she had children. I was supposed to be the responsible one who quietly carried the weight, paid the bills, and stayed in the background. But that day at Easter lunch, I decided to remind them that I was not just the background character in their family drama. My dad looked down at his plate like maybe the ham was suddenly the most fascinating thing in the world. My mom let out this nervous laugh, the kind that says, "Oh, you're joking, right?" But when I didn't laugh with her, her face started to shift. And Megan, well, she went red immediately. She opened her mouth to say something about how this was Mom and Dad's house, how it was part of our family, how it wasn't mine to claim, but before she could even finish the sentence, I asked her one question that hung in the air like a storm cloud. "Do you even know who has been paying the property taxes for the last several years?" Her jaw tightened, but she didn't answer, and that silence was louder than anything. What made it almost surreal was that I wasn't raising my voice. I wasn't making a scene. I was just stating facts. Facts that had been ignored because no one wanted to deal with them. And as much as they wanted to dismiss me, they couldn't because I wasn't bluffing. I could feel my phone in my pocket with every receipt and record sitting right there in my files, ready to be pulled up in seconds. But I didn't even need the phone because I had already planned for this moment long before it arrived. They thought they were ambushing me, but really, I had been preparing for years. I looked at my mom and I said, "Do you really think this house would even still be here if I hadn't stepped in when I did?" She blinked, like she couldn't decide whether to keep pretending or finally admit the truth she had been burying. My dad shifted in his chair, and I could tell he remembered exactly what I was talking about, even if he wished I hadn't said it out loud. Megan rolled her eyes, muttering something about how I always make everything about money, but I stopped her cold by sliding a thin envelope from my bag and setting it on the table. The envelope wasn't thick or flashy, but I saw my mother's face the second she noticed the name printed in the corner. It was my attorney's. And that was the moment she realized this wasn't some empty threat or dramatic performance. This was documented, filed, certified reality. I leaned back and said, "Look, I don't want to ruin lunch, so here's what we'll do. On Tuesday, we can sit down with someone who can explain this better than I can." My voice was steady, almost casual, but inside I felt the release of years of being dismissed and overlooked. I wasn't asking for their approval, I wasn't asking for permission, I was telling them how it was going to be. Megan tried to laugh it off, saying I was exaggerating, that Mom had always planned for her to have the house, but I didn't even bother engaging. Instead, I tapped the envelope lightly and said, "This will explain everything." The room went quiet again, and for a split second, I could see the balance of power shift. They weren't looking at Megan anymore, they were looking at me. And not the way they usually looked at me, like I was the responsible one they could lean on, but like they were finally realizing I was the one holding all the cards. My dad cleared his throat, my mom sipped her water, and Megan crossed her arms so tight I thought she might leave the table altogether. I didn't push it further. I didn't need to. The silence was enough. I ended the meal on my terms, calmly standing up and taking my plate to the sink, like nothing earth-shattering had just happened. But everyone else sat frozen, and I could feel their eyes on me as I left the room. The thing about truth is that once it's out there, you can't shove it back in the box. They could try to spin it, they could try to argue, but deep down they knew. And the best part? The real details, the kind that would cut through every excuse they had been clinging to, hadn't even been laid on the table yet. That was coming next, and I was more than ready. Because when Tuesday came, it wasn't going to be about jokes or who deserved what or who had kids. It was going to be about facts, signatures, and legal reality. And I couldn't wait to watch the looks on their faces when the full story finally hit them. By the time I left Easter lunch, I had already decided that I was done letting everyone pretend that the house floated here on good intentions and casseroles, because the house was standing only because years ago I looked at a stack of late notices. A tax lien warning that could have triggered a sale, an insurance cancellation letter that no one mentioned to me until the grace period had already slipped by, and I told myself that if I did not act right then, the place I grew up in would be torn away not by fate but by laziness and denial, so I did what the responsible child does when everyone else is busy narrating their own sainthood. I called a realtor I trusted to give me a fast valuation without the sugarcoating. I called a mortgage officer who owed me a favor and could move quickly without drama, and I called an attorney who specialized in clean, boring structures that keep chaos from eating families alive, and together we built the dullest little solution that ever saved a home. A simple holding company with one purpose: to buy out the mortgage, secure the title, and record a lifetime lease for my parents so they could live here until they took their last breath without anyone rattling a set of keys in their face. My mom did not tell anyone about the lien letter because, in her words, she did not want to worry people, which is another way of saying she wanted me to keep paying without naming what I was paying for. And when she texted me that first time asking for a little bridge until the next check came in, I believed it, because I wanted to believe that a bridge meant a crossing and not a settlement, so I sent the money and then I sent more. And pretty soon there was a pattern where I covered property taxes in the spring, the insurance renewal in the summer, the roof patch after a storm, the furnace repair before winter, and every time the promise was the same soft thing: we will pay you back when things stabilize. Except things never stabilized because the family story prefers a dependable daughter over an accurate balance sheet. Meanwhile, my sister wrote in the group chat about how exhausted she was from caregiving, how she was juggling school pickups and prescriptions, and how the moral arc of the universe surely owed her a deed, and while she was typing, I was the one driving our dad to the specialist who would not accept the base insurance plan and paying the difference on my card because I wanted the appointment, not a debate. I kept the proof because I've learned that memory is a slippery thing in families that canonize feelings and delete facts, so I scanned every receipt and saved every confirmation. I labeled each transfer with a clean note. And I kept a physical copy of the important documents in a fireproof folder in the freezer because that is where my grandmother used to keep her deeds, and I liked the childish feeling of reaching past the ice to touch something that could not be argued with. The mail started arriving addressed to the little company rather than to my mother, which she waved off as a clerical quirk, but my father would sometimes tilt an envelope and read the return address like a man peeking at the answer key, and I could tell he knew. Even if he did not want to be the one to say it out loud, because saying it out loud would mean telling my sister that casseroles are not currency and that car seats do not entitle you to someone else's property. The more Megan insisted that the house should be hers because family, the more determined I became to stop feeding a machine that pretended I was invisible while it ran on my money. So after Easter I opened my laptop, logged into the account that my mother had named the bridge, and I looked at the river of transfers that had turned into an ocean. Then I clicked one button that froze the card. And I created a new account in my parents' names with me and my father as signers for household bills only, no discretionary reimbursements, no mystery errands, no vague favors, just utilities, insurance, taxes, and repairs, because if you want to keep a house safe you make the boring things sacred, and you let the noisy things fend for themselves. I did not announce it with a speech. I simply sent a short message to the family thread saying that starting this week, all house expenses would be processed through the new account and that I would handle scheduling and payments directly with Dad. So nothing got lost, and then I turned my phone face down and let the storm roll in. It took about 1 minute for my sister to explode with accusations about control and punishment, and another minute for my mother to ask if we could talk about this privately because Megan was sensitive and did not deserve to be embarrassed. And right when I could feel the familiar gravity of their guilt tugging at me, my attorney's email landed with perfect timing. A neatly worded invitation for Tuesday afternoon, listing the participants and the purpose. An overview of the recorded memorandum of trust, the lifetime lease, and the rules that keep title changes from being scribbled on the back of a napkin and called destiny, and I forwarded that invite to the thread without commentary because I was tired of commentary and ready for translation. The read receipts popped up one by one like tiny lights in a hallway. Then Megan wrote that I would not dare to parade our family in front of a lawyer as if we were strangers needing instructions, and I answered with the simplest truth I own. That I had already dared when I saved the house the first time, and that Tuesday was not a parade, it was a mirror, and she was welcome to look away if she preferred a prettier story. Then I added one more line, a kindness wrapped in iron, that if she needed help understanding the documents I would bring certified copies and a highlighter, because this was not about punishing her. This was about ending the confusion that had been profitable for the wrong people for far too long. My mother typed and deleted without sending for what felt like an hour, even though it was probably a minute. My father sent a quiet thumbs up that meant he would be there, and I put my phone down and went to the freezer to check the folder. Because I want the meeting to be orderly and undeniable, and because once you decide to stop being the bridge, you have to commit to the far side. When Tuesday finally arrived, I walked into the attorney's office with the kind of calm you only get after you have replayed a scene in your head 100 times and rehearsed every possible reaction, every possible denial, and every attempt to twist the story into something prettier than it really is, and I sat at that long table waiting for the rest of my family to shuffle in with their mix of entitlement, defensiveness, and practiced innocence. My mom tried to look casual as she sat down, smoothing the stack of papers she had brought even though they were meaningless in comparison to the folder already resting in front of Attorney Harris. While my dad kept his eyes down like maybe if he stayed quiet long enough he could slip through this without having to admit he had known more than he let on, and my sister Megan walked in late with her chin high, carrying the performance of a woman convinced she could still spin everything into her favor if she only leaned hard enough on the fact that she had children and I did not. Harris, who had the patience of a man who had dealt with every kind of family circus imaginable, started without ceremony, laying out the simple facts that had been buried under years of excuses. The property was purchased by the holding company. The title had been transferred to the trust, the lifetime lease had been signed and recorded, and nothing about any of that could be undone with sentimental speeches or assumptions about who was most deserving. He said it plainly, without a trace of drama, but the words landed like bricks, one after the other, and I could see the realization creep across my mother's face, not all at once but in small flickers, as if she was slowly recognizing that she had built her promises to Megan on nothing more than air. Megan interrupted almost immediately, insisting that none of it mattered because intent should carry as much weight as paperwork, that the spirit of family meant my mom had the right to decide where the house would go. And she tried to dress her claim in the language of caregiving and sacrifice, painting herself as the one who had been present while I, in her words, only threw money at problems. Harris didn't even look up from his papers when he asked who had driven Ron to appointments in the last 2 years, who had signed the checks that covered the insurance lapses, who had handled the roof replacement, and my father, who had been sitting in guilty silence, cleared his throat and admitted that most of those responsibilities had fallen on me. The room went quiet again, but this silence was heavier than the one at Easter, because this time it came with evidence. Then Harris pulled out another folder and slid across copies of the so-called caregiver stipend payments, neatly documented as reimbursements to Megan, which had been drawn from the same account I had been refilling under the label Bridge. He asked, very calmly, what services those payments had covered, and my sister's face turned red as she fumbled through an explanation about errands, phone calls, and occasional help with prescriptions. It was not lost on anyone at the table that the numbers on those checks looked far too large for the minor tasks she described, and my mother tried to interject, saying it was all in good faith. But Harris shut it down with the kind of professional tone that makes excuses sound small. He explained that good faith does not erase documented financial reality, and that continuing to funnel money this way would risk accusations of misrepresentation or worse. At that point, my sister pulled out what she clearly thought was her trump card, waving a recently signed power of attorney that my mother had given her, as if that single page gave her the authority to override everything else, and Harris took it, scanned it briefly, and then explained in the driest possible terms that it was void in practice, because it conflicted directly with the trust, which had been filed and recorded years earlier. He explained that my mother could not give away power she no longer held, and the look on Megan's face as that sank in was a mixture of disbelief and fury. My mother looked wounded, like she had been tricked, but the truth was that she had signed documents she did not bother to read because she thought they would never matter. Then Harris turned to my mother with a new document already prepared, a revocation of that flawed power of attorney, and asked her to sign it to prevent future conflicts. She hesitated, glancing at my father, who gave the slightest nod, and then she signed, her hand trembling but steady enough to make the ink permanent. It was the quietest, cleanest undoing of a backroom deal, and my sister knew it. From that moment forward, no title transfer, no change, and no legal maneuver could happen without Harris's countersignature under the trust's terms, and the loophole she had been counting on slammed shut in one motion. As if to twist the knife just a little deeper, Harris reached into his stack and played a voicemail from months earlier, one that my mother had left on Megan's phone, where she sweetly promised her the house right after texting me for one last bridge to cover overdue taxes. The contradiction sat in the air like a neon sign, and I didn't need to say a word because the truth had been spoken in their own voices. My mom stared at the table, my dad rubbed his temples, and Megan glared at me as if I had engineered the entire setup just to humiliate her, when in reality all I had done was keep records and let the facts speak. I did not gloat, I did not raise my voice, I simply leaned back and said, "Now everything matches." Because it finally did. The stories, the payments, the promises, the debts, all of it lined up in a way that could no longer be twisted. The meeting ended without hugs, without resolution, but with the kind of clarity that no one could walk away from pretending it hadn't happened. And as we left the office, I knew the story was far from finished, because exposure is only the first step. The real fight begins when the people who have lived off illusions realize they have to face boundaries for the first time. After that meeting with Harris, the atmosphere inside the family shifted in ways that were both predictable and unsettling. Because once the legal reality had been laid out in plain language, there was no way to pretend anymore that this house was still an open prize waiting for my mother to bestow on her chosen child. And yet my sister could not let go of the narrative that she had somehow earned it through moral points. The group chat, which had always been filled with small updates and little jokes, quickly turned into a battlefield where every word I wrote was met with suspicion, and every silence from me was interpreted as arrogance. While cousins and aunts who had never contributed a dollar to the household maintenance suddenly had very strong opinions about what counted as real family loyalty. My mother, embarrassed and angry at being caught promising something she did not own, tried to frame me as cold and transactional, accusing me of humiliating her in front of outsiders, and my father sat in the middle like he always did, quietly acknowledging I was right, but never willing to say it loudly enough to shield me from the criticism. I decided that if they wanted to make this about narratives, then I would take control of the story, not with speeches or accusations, but with structure. Because the truth is that families only fight over assets when boundaries are vague and responsibilities are invisible, and I was done carrying both of those burdens. I drew up a clear plan that outlined exactly what would happen with the house, not in theory or sentiment, but in documented steps, and when I presented it, I did it with the calmness of someone who had already rehearsed their outrage and chosen to ignore it. I explained that my parents would keep a lifetime lease guaranteeing their right to remain in the home without interference, that a prepaid care annuity had already been funded to cover their medical support and household upkeep, and that after they passed the property would not go to any single child, but would be sold with the proceeds divided between a small family education fund in our grandparents' names and a charitable program supporting first-generation students. The reaction was exactly what I expected. Megan accused me of stealing her children's future, painting me as a villain who wanted to deny them the stability of a family home, while my mother echoed the same line with more guilt and less volume, saying that I was robbing her grandchildren of what was rightfully theirs. I refused to let the conversation slide back into guilt, and instead I opened the ledger I had been keeping, a quiet record of every so-called loan I had extended to Megan over the years, each one labeled with date, amount, and excuse. The total was large enough to make her shift uncomfortably in her chair, and I told her very plainly that those debts could either be forgiven quietly if she accepted the structure, or they could be formally attached as claims against her inheritance if she continued to push. For once, she did not have a quick retort, because she understood that my words were not a bluff and that I had the documentation to back every line. Still, I knew that words and ledgers would not be enough to change her behavior, because Megan had always lived by exploiting loopholes, whether it was slipping her daycare clients into the driveway and calling it helping out, or using the house address for deliveries that had nothing to do with our parents, but brought the city notices to my mailbox. So I took the step that felt like both the most satisfying and the most necessary. I handed her a formal notice ending all home business use of the property. It was not an emotional demand or a petty jab. It was a legally clean, enforceable notice backed by city codes and signed under the trust. From that moment forward, she could no longer use the house as a backdrop for her side hustle. No more cars idling in the driveway. No more packages stacked on the porch with her clients' names. Every fine I had quietly paid for her misuse of the property was documented, and with that notice I made sure there would be no new ones. The expression on her face when she realized I had thought of every angle was almost enough to make the years of frustration worth it. She wanted to argue, to claim it was unfair, but Harris had already filed the supporting paperwork with the city clerk's office, and arguing against me would now mean arguing against official records, something even she knew better than to attempt. My mother accused me of being cruel, of putting paperwork above family, and in that moment she demanded that I make a choice between family loyalty and what she dismissed as legal games. I reached into my bag and slid another sealed envelope across the table toward her, not raising my voice, not making a speech, just pushing it into her hands and saying, "I already chose." She didn't open it right away, too caught up in indignation to notice that the letter inside was not about punishment, but about boundaries that would finally keep this family from collapsing under the weight of unspoken debts and entitled promises. As I left that night, I could feel the tension radiating behind me, but I also knew something important had shifted. For the first time, my sister could not manipulate the situation into her favor with guilt or performance, and my mother could not hand out assets she did not own as rewards for loyalty. The house was no longer a bargaining chip or a stage for drama. It was protected, defined, and structured in a way that placed every responsibility and privilege where it belonged. They might hate me for it now, but deep down they knew it was the only way to stop the endless cycle of promises and resentments. And I knew that the final envelope, the one my mother still hadn't opened, would make sure the truth stayed permanent, because once she read it there would be no turning back. When my mother finally tore open the sealed envelope I had slid toward her days earlier, the entire house seemed to hold its breath, because inside was not a stack of accusations or threats, but a letter written in my own hand, laid out in language so simple and clear that even the most stubborn family storyteller could not twist it into something else. It began with a timeline, not emotional or exaggerated, but a straightforward photocopy trail of every so-called bridge transfer I had ever made, from the first desperate request to the most recent plea disguised as a small favor, each one listed with date, amount, and purpose. Alongside it was the receipt for the prepaid care annuity I had set up for my parents. ensuring that their medical needs and basic living expenses would be covered until the end of their lives without ever again relying on last-minute texts or hidden debts. And finally, at the bottom of the letter, there was a short set of boundaries written without apology. No promises of my property to anyone, no more guilt-laced requests, and no more backroom arrangements that pretended feelings outweighed facts. My mother read in silence, her lips pressing tighter with each line, while my father leaned in closer, his eyes scanning every word with the relief of a man who had waited years for the truth to be written plainly. When she reached the end, her hands trembled slightly, and she looked at me not with the rage I had braced myself for, but with a mixture of shock and recognition, as if she finally understood that I had not been trying to embarrass her, but to stop the cycle that had been grinding us all down. My father signed the lease addendum Harris had prepared, reaffirming their right to remain in the home for life, and when I handed my mother a faded photograph from our childhood tucked between the pages, she broke just a little, whispering that she had kept promising Megan the house because she thought it was the only way to keep peace at the table. I told her quietly that peace built on lies always collapses, and that now, at least, she could stop carrying that weight. Megan, on the other hand, stared at the notice like it was a personal betrayal etched in ink, and when I turned to her, I did not sugarcoat the reality. I told her she could be furious if that made her feel better, but that her anger did not change the fact that her children would grow up without inheriting her debts, because the house she thought she was losing was never hers to lose in the first place. I told her that when the time came, she would have the chance to apply for help from the education fund for her kids, the same way every cousin could, but that the days of her entitlement being rewarded with silent subsidies were over. She wanted to argue, I could see it in the twitch of her jaw, but for once there were no words she could summon that could bend the truth. I knew, though, that justice in families rarely feels like victory in the moment, so I chose a closing act that no one could ignore. At the next extended family gathering, with uncles and cousins all around, I stood up and calmly announced the creation of the education fund and scholarship in our grandparents' names, explaining that it would give future generations a chance to step forward without repeating the mistakes of the past. I saw heads nodding, some out of genuine approval and some out of cautious calculation, but what mattered was that the story of the house had been rewritten in a way no one could undo. The property was no longer a contested trophy or a whispered promise. It was a foundation for something bigger than one sibling's entitlement. My mother clutched the letter again that night, rereading the parts that cut her most, and my father sat beside me on the porch, asking quietly if we were finally okay. I told him we were not perfect, but we were finally honest, and that was more valuable to me than any illusion of harmony. He squeezed my hand, and for the first time in years I felt like someone in that house saw me not just as the dependable one, but as the person who had carried the truth all along. Inside, Megan sulked in silence, unable to process the fact that every door she had been banking on had closed, and while her glare could have burned holes through the walls, her anger no longer mattered, because the structure was sealed, the documents were recorded, and the plan was unshakable. I left that night knowing I had not won a prize, but something better. I had enforced the truth. The house was safe for my parents, the family name was tied to something constructive rather than divisive, and my sister's endless appetite for special treatment had finally been denied in a way that no guilt, no speech, and no manipulation could reverse. The audience I imagined, those friends who would one day hear this story over coffee, would not hear a tale of cruelty but of boundaries, of years of silence broken with a plan so solid it left no room for dispute. And as I closed the door behind me, I said one last line to myself, a quiet truth I had carried for far too long. I did not need to win approval or affection. I only needed to end the game. And in that moment, I knew I had.